Tuinen is an associate professor of philosophy at Erasmus University of Rotterdam. His latest books are The Philosophy of Mannerism, From Aesthetics to Modal Metaphysics, 2022, and the most recent book is The Dialectic of Ressentiment, Pedagogy of the Concept, 2023. So thank you very much, Sjoerd, for having accepted this interview. My first question is that after mannerism, what brought you to this book, to this project?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me. Obviously, there is no link between the two books, at least not except maybe on a very deep metaphysical level. I would also say that in a way this book was already started earlier than the project on mannerism. Back in the day when I wrote my master's thesis in sociology, I wrote on Nietzsche, and what then was called the sociology of knowledge in Nietzsche, and then I extended it into Foucault and others. But in a way it was, I tried to do what I was of course not yet able to do as a student 20 years ago. I returned to Nietzsche in a way, not in the sense of wanting to write a book on Nietzsche, but rather to write a book about my fascination with this weird concept of ressentiment, which of course has become increasingly popular in recent years. So when I started telling people like I'm going to write a book about this was about 2008, 9, I already said, oh yeah, this is extremely topical, you need to hurry up. Now is the time for a book on ressentiment, and then I already felt that, I don't know, this concept is already very old, I'm not so sure. Of course this had to do with the rise of populism in Western Europe, and this is also the time of the war on terrorism, so the discourse on especially Muslim fundamentalism, these sorts of things, they were kind of related almost in a very natural way to ressentiment for most people. I come from the Netherlands and remember in the early 2000s, of course around the time of the rise of Pim Fortuyn, one of the vanguard populist leaders in Europe. He was of course also killed, murdered in 2002. I remember somebody writing about Fortuinism as a doctrine of rancor. This is a reference to a text by a Dutch writer called Meerte Braak from the 30s, who described the rise of the National Socialist movement in the Netherlands in the same terms. And so he thought, this writer in the early 2000s, saw something similar happening again. And one could say that there has emerged a whole industry again. There's a sort of return of resentment, or ressentiment as I prefer to call it, that has occurred in the 2000s in response to the rise of populism. In particular also, if you follow Google Trends, like trending search terms, you can see that in 2016 there was a real peak in the searches for the politics of resentment, having to do with Brexit, with the Trump election, these sort of things. So in a way, as it turns out, the concept of ressentiment is still very actual, has always remained very actual, and in a way is a bit of an evergreen. And that of course gives rise to doubt. And then of course you have to wonder, well, such an ahistorical concept, what does it actually do? So my idea when I started the project was, but of course it's only when you work on it that gradually all these things become clear and start to make sense. My initial idea was of a certain fascination for a concept in Nietzsche, where ressentiment, which only appears very late in his work and is not very much elaborated, it doesn't hold a very systematic place, except maybe as the counterpoint of the affirmative life. Right? What is not affirmative, what the non-affirmative life looks like, is the life of the Mensch des Ressentiments, usually translated as the man of resentment, but obviously it's not a gendered notion in itself. Especially, unfortunately, in a way, not in Nietzsche, because he associates it with women in particular. We can talk about that more later, but I would say, so I've always had this fascination for this Nietzschean concept from the early days, my late adolescent years when I read Nietzsche, like many people. And then also, of course, it does have a certain descriptive power in describing how the have-nots may feel against the haves, or how those fearing the loss of status anxiety, why they vote against their class interest and against their socioeconomic interest. And it does explain certain things. But one thing it does not explain, it also has a very strong morally disqualifying power, because as soon as you tell someone, a feminist or a migrant or anybody who makes the tiniest of emancipatory claim, that their claim is actually rooted in ressentiment, then of course this is a way of disqualifying it, in a way of discarding this claim. And that's of course one of the main ideological performances also of this concept of ressentiment. But the main problem with this concept is that although it has this descriptive power, it has morally disqualifying, a polemical power, it doesn't really have a very strong power of explaining the situation in which it actually features. And this is what my book is about. Why it doesn't have that, and and that's trying to discover, elaborate conditions under which perhaps the concepts might be relevant, and distinguish these particular cases from the majority of cases where indeed ressentiment is really just, part of the vocabulary in which liberalism diagnoses its own impasses without offering any perspective on overcoming it.
So what is ressentiment and what brought you to this project?
What brought me to this project is a long-standing fascination with this concept. I wrote my master's thesis in sociology on Nietzsche and uptakes of Nietzsche in French philosophy, like so many other people, I think. Of course, I've gone back to this moment 25 years ago when I was working on this, trying to do something that at the time I was not yet capable of. That is, elaborate a critical take on this concept that already exerted a certain fascination on me 25 years ago, this concept of ressentiment, which Nietzsche only develops very late in his work, as sort of the counterpoint of the affirmative life, which is like the great question of his work. At the time when I was working on Nietzsche, there was also the beginning of the rise of populism in Europe. Right? This was the time when Sjoerd van Tuinen in the Netherlands sort of threatened to win the elections until he was shot. And it's a time in which the mainstream media also, I wouldn't say demonized him, but anyway they did, by comparing him to the rise of the national socialist movement in the Netherlands in the 30s. And there was a famous piece written by a Dutch journalist called Fortuinism as a Doctrine of Rancor, which basically repeated a gesture made by a Dutch writer called Menno ter Braak in the 30s, who said that the National Socialist movement was a doctrine of rancor, right? A kind of spectacular but ultimately fake form of politics, rooted in underbelly feelings, in need of a very strong enemy figure, not in order to annihilate the enemy, but just in order to legitimate one's own kind of position as a victim and so on. So ressentiment has been very much part of the liberal discourse about the threats to, perceived threats to democracy since the early 2000s, in terms of the rise of populism, the rise of fundamentalism. And in this sense, it belongs to the same sort of category of concepts like fanaticism, denialism, kind of, or even a concept like conspiracy thinking. It's part of the sort of something that we can call supercilious theory, in which liberalism diagnoses its own perversions, so to speak. It's the self-diagnosis of liberalism, by liberalism, of toxic liberalism. This is how the concept has been used since the last 25 years, I would say. Perhaps even much older. I'd like to elaborate more on that later. Obviously, this is not necessarily how Nietzsche conceived of the concept, but in any case, it's how the concept appeared in public discourse in the past 25 years. And in this sense, it has a certain fascination as a ready-made theory for why people vote against their class interests and so on. It has a certain descriptive power and truth to it. This explains also a boom in terms of the literature on ressentiment. You can also see how in 2016, so the year of Brexit and the Trump election, there was an explosion in Google search trends around the words politics of resentment. Many books have appeared, especially by social scientists, who use this concept to explain an enormously wide range of phenomena, from like Trump voters in the Midwest to the incel movement, to explaining kind of why there are so many people in the global winner-take-all society who will not easily be appeased now that they are all exposed to certain Western ideals of the good life, which they are going to be aspiring to. But the aspiring classes, there's a famous Indian writer, Pankaj Mishra, who wrote this book, Age of Anger. He really emphasizes how there's a certain bad infinity to the demands for equality or wealth, or the demand for having the same standards as we have in the Netherlands or in Denmark or whatever in Western Europe. A demand that can never be satisfied, and it also thrives on its insatisfaction, because it is lured or fired by the promise of a certain notion of equality, and at the same time frustrated by a persistent inequality. And again, in any case, this is all part of the standard liberal self-diagnosis of its own impasses. So it has an extraordinary descriptive range, I would say, the concept of ressentiment. At the same time, it contains no information about how to overcome these impasses. So it is blind in a way to its own ideological circumstances, its own ideological performances. So my aim with the book has been to criticize the established discourses on ressentiment, which are very omnipresent, and in a way also to see, to define the conditions under which the concept could be relevant, and of course also set the conditions under which we can also just disqualify the concept, because I think that's what we need. We need to be very careful with a concept like this. Do not take it at face value, and above all, do not become another diagnostician of ressentiment. That is somebody who sees ressentiment everywhere as a sort of catch-all explanation for what's wrong in the world.
So, I mean, talking about Mishra, this Indian author, yeah, I have a quote from you, quoting you, Mishra and Fukuyama are most emphatic. We should finally accept that people are not guided by economic reason alone, something that you also mentioned there, yeah, indirectly. Besides calculating beings, we are also in need of recognition and susceptible to envy and pride, the keyword envy. Worse, the modern masses are prone to hysteria, scapegoating, and fanaticism. Our aim, as Spinoza warned over 300 years ago, should be not to deride, bewail, or exasperate these passions, but to understand them, end of quote. I have the impression that your book is actually not only about ressentiment, but also a kind of reconciliation of ressentiment and empathy, in a sense that you try to emancipate ressentiment from judgment. Do you agree? I mean, you're trying to really.
Well,
I mean, talking about it like not accepting ressentiment at face value, or this jargon of ressentiment, this like recent understanding of ressentiment. You try to sort of emancipate it from some sort of judgmental understanding.
For sure. It is no coincidence that somebody like Fukuyama, in the mid-2010s, suddenly discovers ressentiment. Of course, it already featured in his book On the End of History. But then in the mid-2010s, he relates it to a problem that was not very prominent in 1988-89, namely that of identity politics. Yeah. So, of course, there is a very established discourse that says that identity politics is an articulation of ressentiment. People identify with their status as victims, and they really need to identify as historically or culturally or whatever as some sort of victim, even if this identification is against their own interest. Because of course, by identifying with the victim, one also entrenches their victimhood. So, in the quote you read, I contrast Fukuyama and others to people like Paul Krugman, who also try to explain this basic liberal paradox. Why do people vote against their self-interest? And they just say, well, they're stupid, or people are just resentful. But they do this in a way that doesn't lead to further comprehension of what's going on. It's just in a way, they really give up the analysis, the possibility of a better understanding, and just say, yeah, people are irrational. So people like Mishra, Fukuyama, then step into this lacuna of explanation and try to come up with some basic effective algorithms to explain why people are irrational and behave irrationally, and in a way rationalize it. But rationalizing ressentiment is precisely what I have tried not to do. You asked me about judgment. I think, in terms of Fukuyama and Mishra, yes, on the one hand, ressentiment is like inevitable. It is like it's part of the basic effective infrastructure of globalized liberalism. It's inevitable. It's unavoidable. And yes, we are doomed in a way, in a sense. But it also implies a judgment, right? Because it still implies that people, in a way, are stuck in their own bad infinity, in the bad infinity of a certain desire for emancipation that could never be fully satisfied. Especially in the case of Fukuyama, who of course is an outspokenly conservative theorist. It is this infinity of ressentiment, the infinity of emancipatory claims that needs to be curtailed somehow. We need to understand that ressentiment is what drives these claims, but that there is a risk of these claims being perverted by ressentiment. So we must at all times be able to separate what are rational claims and what are irrational claims, what are true claims of emancipation, what are inauthentic claims of emancipation. And so that's really, but then you're really doing theory or in the mode of judgment. I'm talking about ressentiment in the mode of judgment. For me, but this is really the end point of the book. We start at the end in a way with this question. I don't think ressentiment is to be defended. So I don't, in that sense, I'm not going to say that ressentiment actually is what we need more of or something like that. I do wonder if it is also possible to not just speak about the ressentiment of the aspiring classes, etc., but whether you can actually interpolate the famous Mensch des Ressentiments, the man of ressentiments. Nietzsche describes it, but of course he does it in an ungendered way. Can we actually interpret ressentiment in a way that our very naming of the ressentiment, the very mode of address, contributes to its overcoming? What you find lacking in people like Fukuyama and Mishra is precisely this kind of, I would say, sort of a reflexive buffer about your own mode of address, about your own mode of enunciating a concept like ressentiment. So that's why at the core of the book is what I call, borrowing from Deleuze, the method of dramatization. You are always yourself part of the drama in which a concept features. And it is the drama that decides the meaning and relevance of a concept. It is never the concept by itself that can do that.
Right.
So as soon as you think that you have a concept as a ready-made and that you can use for, quick armchair political analyses, then you've already lost touch with the drama that you're nonetheless a part of. So how to resituate the concept of ressentiment, our knowledge of it, our discourses of it. And in that sense, see what are interesting modes of speaking about ressentiment and when does it become uninteresting.
Right. Wonderful. Another part of the title is like pedagogy of a concept. Like quoting Foucault, I have a sentence: every psychology is a pedagogy. All decipherment is a therapeutics. You cannot know without transforming.
Yes.
End of quote.
Well, when Foucault says that, he said, sorry.
Transforming is a key word here in relation to pedagogy.
Yeah.
Is it so also, I mean, it also applies, does it also apply to pedagogy of ressentiment? I mean, especially talking about the drama of ressentiment.
There are many ways of doing pedagogy, and what Foucault talks about is that you cannot talk psychologically without psychologizing the people you talk about. So, psychology always traps you in psychologizing language, and that means that, the more we understand ourselves psychologically, and there is, of course, a very strong tendency of a culture of inwardness, where we really understand everything from politics and art to whatnot, or finance and capitalism, in terms of psychological concepts such as greed or guilt or and so on. So yes, speaking psychologically implies a certain pedagogy, but that's not at all how I use it, right? So for me, the subtitle, Pedagogy of Concept, is a clarification of the main title, the dialectic of ressentiment. Hegel, of course, says that philosophy is the encyclopedia of the concept, so it's about an omniscient mode of knowing that is over time acquired, and philosophy reconstructs this process through which spiritual life becomes transparent to itself. That, of course, is no longer feasible. My reference in terms of pedagogy is not Foucault, but Deleuze and Guattari, who at the end of Qu'est-ce que la philosophie, their book on what is philosophy, they say, well, we are no longer in the era of the encyclopedia of the concept, we are in the era of the marketing of the concept, which is, I think, precisely what people like Mishra and Fukuyama are doing, right? You take some kind of ready-made concept, and then you explain all sorts of phenomena. You're trying to sell the concept, and that leads, of course, to very banal theorizing. So Deleuze and Guattari, they, I think, in a way, go back to the pragmatists who all, like Dewey, James, Whitehead, who all wrote books on pedagogy. And they say, well, actually, the task of philosophy today is the pedagogy of concept. And for me, that means to show how in the discourses on ressentiment there are tipping points, there are thresholds where the meaning flips of the word, there are the gestures in which the concept works, they're entirely different. And so writing this book is in a way to show how that is possible and when it happens, how concepts can be reinvented and also reclaimed for certain purposes. So the book is structured around the basic notion that ressentiment, before it has a certain truth value or descriptive value, whatever, is first of all a polemical concept. Right. It's always the other with ressentiment. Ressentiment is like bad breath. It's always the other, never yourself. And someone like Mishra or Fukuyama will probably deny that in the name of empathy. They will say, no, we're trying to describe objective processes in which emancipatory claims undermine themselves in a way. But of course, as you rightfully emphasized, there's actually a judgment at work here. And that's what I mean with polemics. Other authors, like Nietzsche, are much more explicit that ressentiment is a polemical concept, right? Ressentiment is what you need to stay away from. It's what is low, it's what is what belongs to what Nietzsche calls the slaves. That's their basic affective constituent. And then later, the concept is recoined again by someone like Jean Améry, Holocaust Auschwitz survivor, who actually uses it as a concept against both people like Scheler, Max Scheler, in whose, let's say, slipstream people like Fukuyama and Mishra are writing about ressentiment, and against Nietzsche. Because all these people in different ways say that ressentiment is bad, that they speak like doctors about ressentiment, whereas Améry is saying, basically identifies himself with ressentiment and says, actually no, I am the only one entitled to speak the truth about my ressentiment and draw the moral consequences. Right. So he reinvents the concept to such an extent that it actually becomes something positive. He says, only if you feel ressentiment, if you are somehow bound to the past, if you refuse to let bygones be bygones, then you can still have something like a moral consciousness, where a society after the war in Germany wants to move on, ask people to moderate their claims, ask people to forgive and forget. Think of the role of the Truth and Reconciliation Committee in a country like South Africa. These are, in a way, institutions that are meant to manage, channel, and eventually also either overcome, but more likely, in all likelihood, rather, to repress ressentiment. So that's what I mean. There's a certain dialectic where each mode of speaking about ressentiment, in a way, calls forth its own negation. Nietzsche's entire work, but especially the genealogy, which is subtitled A Polemic. And it's a polemic with what he calls priests. Now, priests are precisely those who see ressentiment everywhere, people like Fukuyama and Mishka, and who have a lot of interest in the truth of this diagnosis. Priests themselves are not polemic, they are, of course, aimed at peace, at pacification, so their truth, in a way, is also covering up the polemical situation with which they are nonetheless apart, because what they do precisely is to disqualify emancipatory claims everywhere. So it's a more hidden form of polemic that you find there, and that already existed before Nietzsche starts writing. That Nietzsche denies, Nietzsche enters in an explicit polemic with polemic with the priest. So that's why in the dialectical sequence of the book, the priest comes first. Then we get Nietzsche, who polemicizes against the priest. Then we get Améry, who polemicizes against both. And then you also have a sort of complete polemical triangle with three conceptual personae, dramatic figures, the priest, Nietzsche, and the person that I call the witness of Ressentiment. And they have a sort of a complete polemical relation. The question I raise in the book, my contribution, if you want, with the pedagogy of the concept is, okay, can we also get out of this polemical drama of the concept? Is there another dialectical step possible in which we go back to Nietzsche's original aim in the sense that the polemical aspect of Ressentiment is more important than its truth value. But then also see, okay, but that can't be it. And we also need to somehow acknowledge that Ressentiment exists. Nietzsche's recipe, of course, was to keep as much distance from it as possible. Can we also have somebody like Nietzsche's diplomatic agent? Somebody who is actually capable of interpolating the person of Ressentiment in such a way that we don't just deepen their condition and also the polemical situation that separates us. That is the ultimate question, the last stage in the dialectical sequence. The hardest one, and one in which I go back to this pragmatist tradition, especially James, where if we define ressentiment as a certain form of stupidity, a certain form of emotional hardening, in English we could say, for example, ressentiment appears, but my definition of ressentiment would be, there's many of course, and in the book I provide dozens I think, but one definition would be ressentiment is a clogging of reactive affects, such as anger, envy, or malice, as they become ensconced in feeling instead of being expressed in actions, and then articulating through moral indignation, which is of course an impotent articulation as compared to a more active response.
So, like from the very beginning of the book, you have this point that I'm quoting you: in matters of ressentiment, it's impossible to have the last word. Of course, you talked about it. As soon as we think that we are above ressentiment, or that we have uncovered its ultimate meaning, we must ask ourselves whether our own discursive position is not itself infected by the very moralizing stance that we like to think we have acquired the right to detect and detest in others, end of quote. Sometimes I think that you're also addressing psychoanalysis, but my question is, do we need irony in analyzing ressentiment? By irony I mean simply a distance, a kind of affective distance from ressentiment, in the sense that we can also admit our complicity there.
Absolutely, absolutely. And it makes no sense to think, to start from a position where you claim to be free from ressentiment. That absolutely makes no sense. And this is, of course, what most of Nietzsche's own work is about, right? It's about this art of perspectival shifts, where you never really coincide with yourself, where you constantly have to be able to grow out of your ressentiment, keep a distance somehow. And obviously, humor, irony are essential. There is an essential line in, I think it's Beyond Good and Evil, where Nietzsche says that we are always betrayed by what we take too serious. And that is just beautiful, because it precisely describes the complicity with ressentiment in authors like Mishra, like Fukuyama, like Max Scheler, like René Girard is an especially exemplary case of this, where what Sartre would have called the esprit de sérieux, right, binds you to your object to an extent that you cannot see beyond it, that you have to see ressentiment everywhere, all the time, and there is no way to overcome it, there's nothing behind it. This is very much, I think, a characteristic of the bulk of literature on ressentiment, because it is this fixation that provides the authors with their authority over the topic. So the need to discern ressentiment everywhere, in a way, is the perspectival defining trait of the priest, the priest figure in Nietzsche. So how to distance ourselves from that? I previously mentioned that we need something like a diplomatic agent. That is somebody who goes with Nietzsche very far, and in the necessity to keep distance to ressentiment, but who is also capable of engaging with it in a way that does not just dismiss it, or in a way that does not just trigger a reactive response, like, oh yeah, here's another, elite figure who is just going to call my own frustrations with the status quo and disqualify it according to their terms. But somehow he also has the capacity to seduce, as Nietzsche would have said, or lure, as a pragmatist like Whitehead would say, lure people, act as a lure to reconsider their own situation and their own relation to ressentiment. This is, of course, extremely hard. And Nietzsche is very cavalier about it. He says, when I have an issue with somebody, I don't hate them, I send them a pot of jam, And Nietzsche, of course, was full of ressentiment, but especially according to his own definition, where it is a feeling of revenge that articulates it, that turns inward and gets fixated in a form of impotence, and then seeks compensation in moral indignation. The latter part, Nietzsche maybe did differently, but the sense of impotence, of course, is essential.
But isn't the ultimate, sorry to interrupt you, the ultimate pragmatic goal of emancipating ressentiment in that scenario, in the scenario of diplomat's intervention, finally transforming ressentiment to anger? I mean,
yeah, that's no. So I understand the question, but that is precisely where I think we need to be super wary. It is the liberal discourse that wants to emancipate ressentiment, and always to sanitize it, of course, and to say, well, as long as it translates into rational, moderate anger or resentment, as the Scottish enlighteners said, Adam Smith, Joseph Butler, resentment is kind of the legitimate form of ressentiment, the socially acceptable phase, because without resentment, you also cannot have a society. You can't just have a society based on sympathy. You also need resentment whenever a slight occurs, whenever injustice takes place. You need people to stand up for their own rights and for others, and it's called indignation, but it's more or less the same effective structure. And there is a whole industry, I would say, a whole academic industry that sets itself the task of distinguishing between a rational, proportionate resentment and then warning of the slide of resentment into ressentiment. Mm-hmm. So then the task is, of course, always to bring the people of ressentiment back to reason, or try to get them to have a more authentic relation to their ressentiment, so that it can then translate into resentment and be socialized and allow them to acquire recognition. So resentment, in a way, is of course a passion for recognition, whereas ressentiment, in a way, wants to be recognized without the mutual relation with the other. So there's no mutual recognition. No, it's just I am the victim, and the other is by definition evil, because they are those who have made me into a victim, so they deserve no recognition. I can't have recognition, they don't deserve it, and that's what Ressentiment says. I don't think the language of emancipation can work in relation to Ressentiment. So my aim is definitely not to emancipate it. I gave you the example before of Jean Améry. Right? He in a way wants to do that to the extent that he says that, well, actually, when society wants to move on and I am stuck in the past, then we need my ressentiment in all its sickening, toxic, brewing, neurotic aspects as the other of society, to then in a dialectical relation at least make society aware that they're incomplete without me and I'm incomplete without them. So there's a certain as our colleague Zahi Zaloua, who wrote very well about Améry, would say, there is precisely in the partisan aspect of ressentiment, in its particularity, there is something like a universalist stance. There is a universal use of ressentiment to the extent that we need it to educate society about what it would like to repress and forget. So there you can say that Améry tries to ask for recognition for his ressentiment. He wants to legitimize his own ressentiment and say that in this sense he wants some kind of an emancipation as a witness, as a victim, without which universal emancipation could not be thought. So in that sense, there are people who think that ressentiment plays a role in emancipation and needs to be emancipated. I would say, though, a little bit more following Nietzsche, like ressentiment is really not something to be trusted. It doesn't want to be emancipated. Améry, in a way, thinks that he can make his own ressentiment transparent to himself and in this way make it a trustworthy moral resource. But that's precisely what it cannot be, as Nietzsche would say. The person of ressentiment, the soul of the person of ressentiment squints. Seine Seele schielt. So ressentiment was really not something that we can derive any identity or social positionality from. It is really something that needs to be overcome, and we need to grow out of, one way or another. The question, of course, is how is that possible, and who is going to help us do that? I'm saying us, because as you rightfully emphasized, that we are all complicit, ressentiment, and it is not at all clear whether we can do that. What is certain is that repressing it, disqualifying it, pathologizing it, is probably not the way to do it. Right? That is the surest recipe for its further entrenchment.
Right. I mean, perhaps the reason I talked about irony earlier is and was that it visited my mind for a while that irony and ironic thinking and even cynicism and sarcasm and even humor, they're all indirectness or indirect parts of communication, at least anthropologically, yeah. And then when it comes to ressentiment, I think that it is also one of the most indirect manifestations of you might immediately not like my comments, but of anger or hatred or any sort of as you said, non-mutual resentment, I don't know how to call it. But anyway, I think that there is a kind of indirectness that convinces me that is there in the society when it comes to ressentiment. And it is definitely more indirect than anger. Is it also something that you were bearing in mind when you were writing this book?
Well, I think indirectness is a key term here, right? I think one of the contemporary words for ressentiment is passive aggression. So indirectness, of course, is a key aspect of ressentiment. But it's not the same kind of indirectness as irony is.
Yeah, definitely.
There are definitely passive-aggressive forms of irony. So there, I would follow you. I think the category of humor might be more interesting here in the Deleuzian sense, where. I'm not sure if we can heal ressentiment, but at least we can pervert some of its conclusions, or take them to the absurd. But irony, especially to the extent that it is a passive, contemplative position, is something that it might not be able to establish enough distance to ressentiment by itself, I think.
I think I understand your point, and especially I think that what convinces me there is that irony, in the end of the day, still tries to rationalize. I mean, through these steps. Yeah. And you're not looking for a rationalization of ressentiment, as you said. You're more you more tend to bring ressentiment on surface and let it flow, let it go, probably.
Well, in terms of rationalization, at some point, Slavoj Žižek warns for the hermeneutic temptation, where you say, well, ressentiment is typically an articulation or an emotional response, a logical emotional response to persistent social-economic injustice, for example. So why do people vote against their class interest? Well, because they're in a situation that seems to offer no way out. So it's their own impotence. The effect of ressentiment and the emotional translation of their objective socio-economic situation, so to speak. I think that's a little bit too easy. I understand there is an industry for certain types of ressentiment to find an authoritative interpretation, especially white resentment. I can count on a lot of understanding and rationalization by social scientists. This is already much less the case when we're talking about, let's say, Muslim fundamentalists, because then you get terrorism and fanaticism. You have a very different chain of connotations related to ressentiment than when it comes to white resentment. So yeah, I don't think it needs to be rationalized. I think there Nietzsche is much more interesting than the priests who constantly want to interpret it and derive their authority from its interpretation and their attempts also to redirect it. Nietzsche basically says ressentiment is a piece of animal psychology, no more. So it's almost nothing. It's nothing. He says it's meaningless. He says also that in its raw state, it plays no role at the cultural level. There's nothing to interpret there. There's absolutely nothing to find in ressentiment. No explanation, nothing. For Nietzsche, and that is of course the humor, in relation to established, let's say, 19th century discourses, which all deal with public hygiene, which try to explain the new social impulses that are part of bourgeois life, right? Where, of course, bourgeois society triggers its own negation in the form of a new working class that is less equal than they are, somehow this new inequality needs to be legitimated, and the concept of ressentiment plays a key role in this place, both in terms of disqualifying emancipatory claims from the new poor, and in terms of a self-legitimation, where the bourgeoisie says, we're also slaves of the system, but at least we know that we have a ressentiment, we can see it, and thereby we already have a certain superiority over it in relation to those who don't see it and who just want to change the world way beyond the means we have to do this. This is, by the way, what Jacques Rancière calls la haine de la démocratie, the hatred of democracy. He doesn't talk about the infinite desire or the excessive desire of the aspiring classes in relation to the limited means with which we can satisfy their desire. No, he talks about, with the hatred of democracy, he talks actually about liberals who think that democracy needs to somehow be protected against itself because it triggers desires that it could never satisfy. So democracy itself needs to be contained, hence the hatred of democracy. But that all is a discourse that has a level of seriosity that you will never find in Nietzsche. That is not at all Nietzsche's language. This already exists when Nietzsche starts writing with Ressentiment. So the first thing that makes Nietzsche interesting and funny, I wouldn't say ironical, I think others are stuck in a sort of pessimistic irony, like Flaubert, like Dostoevsky, like Girard, the décadence that Nietzsche finds around him, where they talk about the ressentiment in a very funny way, but they're also stuck in it and offer no plausible perspective beyond it. The entirety of Nietzsche's project is precisely to find a new form of humor that allows you to distantiate yourself from this sort of reflexive pessimism, from the prevalent irony through which liberalism reflects on itself and its own impossibilities of still coming to of returning to the sort of the revolutionary energy that it had only half a century ago. It's really about the bourgeois revolution coming to a close without having any clue how to continue. So Nietzsche says that yes, there is ressentiment everywhere, but in a way it doesn't matter, right? What matters for Nietzsche is the way in which ressentiment acquires sort of a structurally or culturally hegemonic force. But then it's no longer ressentiment, it's pure state, a self-undermining piece of animal psychology. Then it is already organized, aimed, and in a way also redirected and turned inward by what he calls 2,000 years of pastoral culture, culture of the priest. So, and of course liberalism is only the secular continuation of this, and its complete lack of a future and so on. And Nietzsche's critique of last man, all of this must be seen in this light, where a sort of very developed and intricate form of ressentiment, which he calls bad consciousness, has become prevalent in Western culture. So bad consciousness is precisely that way of seeing ressentiment everywhere without seeing any solution to it.
Right.
But the necessity to see it everywhere, and also kind of the bad conscience of the capitalist or the liberal who sees it also in himself, so to say, and somehow just from acknowledging it derives some kind of superiority.
Right. Talking about humor, do you think that humor is a significant mechanism in transforming ressentiment, or at least in bringing it on the surface? You say, I'm quoting you, was it not Nietzsche who, in taking his own corpus as a battlefield of diverging interpretations, demonstrated, like no other unfought tensions, in the depth of all true thinking, and the humor it takes to rise to the surface of sense?
Absolutely, yes. At the end of the book, I refer to one of my intellectual teachers, I suppose, Isabelle Stengers, who famously replaces the traditional Western idea of the amour de la vérité, the love of truth, which of course is at the heart of pastoral thought. The amour de la vérité, the subjection to truth, with another concept called the humeur de la vérité. And that's very nice, because then, of course, truth is no longer something you subject to, it's something that you can play with, not in the relativistic sense that truth varies according to subject position. Right? Now, it's about, rather, as Deleuze says, perspectivism is not about the relativity of truth, but the truth of the relational. The truth of the relational means that I am, or we are manifold, but I am also manifold. And there's a whole drama at play in which forms of self-distancing can work, are at work, which have transformative effects. Stengers develops this notion of the humeur de la vérité in relation to a very funny Western philosopher, Leibniz. Right? Leibniz being somebody who, of course, writes against the background of religious wars and encounters a lot of esprit de sérieux among his interlocutors. So he has thousands and thousands of correspondents across Europe, and missionaries beyond Europe. And what he does throughout his work is always not to pacify in a priestly sense by turning ressentiment inwards. No, he tries to pervert everybody's position. He tries to harmonize all these different positions, disarm them in a way, but without denying anybody anything. So, of course, not everybody appreciates it. Some people feel betrayed by someone like Leibniz, who is like like in the way that a diplomat always needs to betray his constituency to some extent. But at the same time, in this way he makes possible, he saves all the positions. And he gives all the positions, all the different, let's say, polemical warring parties, the capacity to re-relate to themselves and to others through this new relational mode of thinking. The monadology in Leibniz is a kind of speculative gesture that allows everybody, that's at least the idea behind it, I think, the praxis of it, that in principle allows everybody to reconceive of themselves in relation to the world, the dramatic situation in which they find themselves. So it's this is what philosophy, I think, can contribute to situations where the positions are very much entrenched and war with one another. You make speculative proposals which have the capacity potentially of transmutation, effective transmutation. This is something you find in Leibniz, something you find in Whitehead, and I think also you will find it in Nietzsche. Although, of course, Nietzsche is very much invested in the polemical genre.
But can I claim that by shifting from the figure of, let's go, that person of that witness, that Améry, to diplomat in that regard, you're taking some distance from Deleuze, or you are taking some distance from intensity towards relationality, because there is some intensity in ressentiment, in that authentic, let's say, claim. There is some intensity there, but you try to distance somehow from this intensity towards that monadology of relationality.
Yeah, because I don't fully trust Améry.
All right.
Not in the traditional sense that you cannot trust a witness in the objective representation of their experience, because that experiences and their memories are, of course, colored and by in so many ways. But that's not what I mean. What I mean is Améry, and the intensity is irresistible. That's why I think he is the archetypical witness of ressentiment. There is no clearer articulation, self-articulation of the person of ressentiment than what Améry does. But he does it in a way that is still conceptually so consistent with what Nietzsche says about ressentiment that it is almost implausible as a first-person experiential account. It's in a way too constructed, and he has good reasons to do that, because he has also philosophical ambitions and he wants to reclaim a concept. But in reclaiming a concept, he also really wants to control it. And he wants to, in a way, also control how other people are going to relate to it. So there is something very, there's no humor, there's no self-distancing in Améry, obviously. It's dead serious. And there's no space for generosity in the sense of, okay, my position is going to actually make other people really rethink how they want to relate to me. Maybe that's of course the aim, but what's very revealing, I think, is that he always speaks about my resentments. Throughout the text, that he, a famous essay at the Mind's Limits, he always talks about my resentments. Nobody will have anything else to say about it. So he, in a way, wants to fully coincide with it. But in this way, you forget that in a way you want to purify also your resentment from anything more life-affirming, anything that could possibly help you, take some distance from it, help you slowly, help that ressentiment become part of a process that leads somewhere else. And he wants to make absolutely sure that does not happen. That makes his writing insanely intensive, but also and much more plausible than what others, priestly figures, would have to say about it. In a way, so it's more plausible than what Fukuyama or Mishra say about ressentiment, because of its intensity. But it is still not plausible enough to the extent that even his ressentiment is part of a situation, a larger drama, in which the very work of exposure, to use a concept of Sarah Ahmed, is going to open it up to something else which he does not want to tolerate. And that something else is, of course, what we need if we want to think of ressentiment beyond something that we can only relate to polemically or relate out of polemically. So if we somehow want to go beyond the traditional dialectic of ressentiment, which I think in a triangular shape really encompasses the entire 150 years of discourse on ressentiment as it exists, then we also need to go beyond Améry somehow. We need to somehow betray him.
Right. I mean, interestingly enough, you're talking about Améry as a survival of Auschwitz, survival of anti-Semitism, or whatever you call it. But ironically enough, let's ask a question a bit actual. What is the follow-up of the diplomatic approach to Palestinian ressentiment today, if there is any?
I don't think Palestinian ressentiment is our biggest worry at this point. I mean, I can see that, you see, from the dominant pastoral point of view on ressentiment, and of course this is what you see when Biden warns Netanyahu that he's going to create so much bad will, and so many generations of ressentiment against Israel, that he should really reconsider his genocidal tendencies, let's put it that way. That's the pastoral stance. But your question was related to Améry, who of course was a liberal Zionist. And that's of course also where the universal use of ressentiment ends. Améry...
So he blocks it actually.
Sorry?
He blocks it, yeah. He blocks this universal...
He claims it from a partisan point of view. But he certainly would not allow it on the side of the Palestinians. The Palestinians did not really exist for him, weirdly enough, because he wrote the preface to Fanon. He was a fan of Fanon. But like Sartre, he couldn't really go, he couldn't really oversee the consequences of the Zionist project for Palestine. So we have nothing to learn from him there.
Okay.
I think, apart from the fact that, of course, the universal use of ressentiment, if there exists such a thing, extends to the Palestinians as well. Personally, I think, as I said initially in reply to your question, I think we have there are much more interesting aspects to look at currently when it comes to the situation of Palestine, especially in Gaza. But if you want to do it in terms of ressentiment, then we need to understand that there too there is a universalist use of ressentiment possible. It's just that they probably wouldn't phrase it that way. Améry phrased it that way, because he was in a polemical engagement with priests who psychologize it and want to heal it, and Nietzsche, who says that we have to forget. The priest wants you to forgive your perpetrators, your torturers. Nietzsche says, no, you just have to forget.
Okay.
Yeah? Because ressentiment for Nietzsche, of course, is the incapacity to forget. Mm-hmm. It's what binds you to the past, and it's what makes that you're constantly overwhelmed by the past. And what doesn't kill me never ceases to overwhelm me. That could be the Améry point of view. And of course that is going to apply for generations of Palestinians as well.
Yeah. I mean, the reason actually I asked that question was that you interestingly answered that, but the reason was that, in an unreflected way, my instinctive reaction was that the American approach to the genocide that's happening, or to a Palestine-Israel issue, is a diplomatic method, but you call it pastoral. Because they say two-state, this monadology came to my mind, but you are absolutely against that. You call it pastoral, you call it a priestly way of dealing with it.
Absolutely, yes. So the priest is the pacifier.
Right.
The diplomat, in the sense that I use affirmatively, is somebody who acknowledges there's a war. Priest does not do that. Priest sees elements among the herd that needs to be contained, but he does not affirm there is a war and that they have a role in this war. Especially not the Christian priest. Jewish priest, of course, in the Nietzschean genealogy is a different. Nietzsche says about the Jews that they are the first true pastoral culture. They invented priesthood as sort of the house on stilts for the population to find its unity and remain a power in the world.
Well, what does the diplomat do? Sorry, Kurt. I need more qualities. What does the diplomat do that makes him different, except from admitting that there is genocide, except that admitting that there is war?
But I mean, I'm not talking about diplomats, somebody who's going to go to, speak in the Security Council or in some United Nations forum.
We are differentiating between priestly and the diplomat.
I'm talking about the more speculative diplomat. For me, I borrow the notion of the diplomat from somebody like Stengers figure, but we'll find this in Leibniz. Somebody who is not just a representative of a certain constituency, but is also capable of betraying them in a way, and whose presence itself is sort of speculative. In this sense, opens the situation up to something else. Maybe at the beginning of our conversation I referred to this Dutch author, Menno ter Braak, who wrote this text called National Socialism as a Doctrine of Rank. Funnily, or interestingly enough, he opens his essay with a reference to a conversation he overheard, where a diplomat spoke about the National Socialists as een troepje gâtés, a bunch of losers, or as Hillary Clinton would have said, a basket of deplorables. And ter Braak says, what he just said in passing, and in a sort of dismissive way, we, the priests of liberal democracy, we need to take extremely serious.
Right.
So the diplomat, a bunch of losers. It was just in passing. It was just funny. Troepje ratés. It sounds actually extremely funny in Dutch. It's very light. It's very, and that's actually where Nietzsche is not wrong. His polemic is not with the people of Ressentiment, it's with the priests, the esprit sérieux. Nietzsche could also have said that. In that sense, actually, Nietzsche is already plays the role of the diplomat.
All right.
Ressentiment is just not very interesting. It's just not really to be taken serious in the first place. And then, of course, when there is a lot of ressentiment, and if we want to acknowledge that we do have to engage it for some reason, then of course we need to go further than Nietzsche and not do it in a pastoral manner. And then it's either we speak out of ressentiment, claim it for ourselves, that's the Améry position, or we try to continue in the diplomatic mode that you actually already find in Nietzsche. In the perspectival sense, and then we end up in a more Leibnizian or pragmatist philosophical approach.
I like this quote from you. I'm reading that this dialectic method that we're just talking about now, this dialectic method also enables me to continue the drama of the philosopher and the secular priest, begun there by elaborating the perspective of two persona that Nietzsche himself did not pay a lot of attention to. First, the person of ressentiment, and second, the philosophical diplomat, whose cunning lies in the simultaneous representation and betrayal of all belligerent positions.
Yeah.
It is my contention that only this last persona contains a plausible perspective on ressentiment's overcoming.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Nietzsche, of course, also has an idea of ressentiment's overcoming, but that is very arcane, heroic. Well, we could say it's based on a certain Greek notion of the agonon, play, sportsmanship. But of course, all these notions today in the liberal context mean something very different than in the Greek context, and therefore, not super interesting. So, indeed, I think it's my task has been to work my way through all these different positions, to really identify with all of them. And to totally situate myself in this polemical triangle, and then in an immanent way try to see if in this, let's say, polemical consistency, we can achieve a little bit more coherence, where it starts making a little bit less sense to call out ressentiment on the other, where it also starts to make a little bit less sense to want to identify with one's own ressentiment, and where it starts a little bit less sense to just discern it everywhere and do everything with ressentiment in the first place. To deactivate all these traditional positions, and in this way find a more playful way, a relation to the concept of ressentiment, and its various phenomenal manifestations.
Right.
That has really been the aim of the book.
And you prefer Leibniz, so you prefer Leipzig, of course.
That's
Berlin. Leibniz to Hegel and Nietzsche. I've written here, what does it look like in practice? Quoting you, this constraint gives Leibniz a practical edge over Nietzsche and Hegel, as it means neither shocking common sense, which was also associated now to your older project, talking about sense, common sense, and reason, nor subsuming it under a more universal abstraction, but calling on the freedom of all the interlocutors to evolve and reinvent themselves. I found it interesting, but how does this constraint hold up in practice?
Poorly, generally. No, but I mean, you're putting a lot of emphasis on the last chapter, in which I tried to go beyond. That's when all the, let's say, the whole archaeology of the discourse of ressentiment is already taking place. And this has been the main struggle, actually, in finishing the book. Of course, everybody wants to have a ready-made recipe for how we're going to finally overcome ressentiment.
Right.
What is the prescription that we can give? And I don't know. And in a way, when you think of voters who have now basically made the party of Geert Wilders in the Netherlands, for example, the Freedom Party, which is basically a fascist, very right-wing party, the biggest party in the Netherlands, do you want to approach, really you want to set them a pot of jam, as Nietzsche said, or should we just call them out? But calling them out will really only lead to a consolidation of positions. So in that sense, I think and ressentiment would be one way of doing it. And of course people do this. Every time there's some move to the right, there's a permanent shift to the right, it's always, people will always talk about this in terms of a politics of resentment. Generally, of course, not claiming a polemical relation to those they're talking about, but it is inherent in the concept, so unearthing that is already part of the diplomatic gesture. Anyway. Showing that you're part of a polemic is absolutely a first start for this, a prerequisite. So that is already definitely I think something that can and must be done, and people must constantly be reminded of. And then, I mean, in the case of Leibniz, it ended very poorly, right? People just didn't trust him in the end. They made all their perspectives relative. He had de-absolutized everybody's point of view. So once people realize that, they start distrusting you. But maybe that's not, I don't know, yeah, but the whole point is to make it not about you. And you have to disappear. And actually, in his book on Leibniz, Deleuze, there's this beautiful, he draws a beautiful portrait of Leibniz where he compares him to Prospero, hero of the Shakespearean tragedy, who bestows richness and himself remains on everybody, and himself remains invisible and disappears also in this sort of let's say situation that has somehow changed tonality, that has somehow been transformed without in a way that is different for everybody. Nobody doesn't really know how it happened, because it happened in a purely immanent way. Leibniz becomes indiscernible from a general process of mutual transformation. That is the ideal, the horizon of that sort of philosophy. But of course, it's not a philosophy book that can do that, especially not in the 21st century. It may have been working in the 17th century with a figure like Leibniz, who really was in touch with intellectuals across the continent, and in a way made himself inseparable from all of them, and in this way put everything in relation, made the intellectual world more coherent by himself becoming indiscernible from everybody else. It's a weird mimetic procedure, which allows for a more playful relation to all these people and the way they relate to each other. It's a very weird, and who would do that today? We have media who do the opposite, of course. Identity politics is on the rise. We have filter bubbles. We have algorithms that reproduce the ressentimental tendencies at an ever higher speed, so to say. So we need new technologies beyond. So basically, I would say this is the limitation of my book, and the limitation of what I have called the pedagogy of the concept. You can through the pedagogy of the concept, show what the political situation of a concept is like, what the stakes are. You can also teach people to become aware of this, to relativize their own stance to some extent, but pedagogy is not politics. Pedagogy is not yet mediation.
Right.
It's not yet the practical critique of a concept, so to speak, which has to happen elsewhere.
I'm going to move on to the next question. I have 2 or 3 questions left, but before that, I think I would be happy if you elaborate on the importance of, because I think you prefer generosity to empathy when it comes to ressentiment. Why is generosity important? Because you repeat this word a couple of times in the book in terms of, and even now, like you mentioned earlier, to be generous. Like the figure of diplomat is generous, is more generous than other figures apparently. How and why is it important? Sorry for the irrelevance of the question, because it's a kind of ethical, political stance there in generosity. It's not necessarily pedagogical.
Yeah, it's a deep question in a way, because a culture of ressentiment is not generous by definition. There's a famous, I don't know. there's a wonderful text, one of his best essays, I think, by Peter Sloterdijk on Nietzsche, called Über die Verbesserung der guten Nachricht, on the improvement of the good message. Nietzsche's fifth evangelium, so Nietzsche's fifth gospel, which is the good message. So how to improve the good message. Where he shows how, of course, the Gospels, and then especially treatises by the Church Fathers, like Paul, Augustine, Tertullian, in particular, they are all based on a very dark anthropology, where there is actually very little place for generosity. Our very language is based on payback. This is what Nietzsche also says in the Preface of Zarathustra, and then later on he talks about tarantulas, which he thinks of Rousseau, but it doesn't matter. And he says that we always look back. We always look back in anger. We cannot get rid of the past. So the task of Zarathustra and the giving virtue of Zarathustra is precisely to somehow help people emancipate from their past, to believe in the healing power of time, to teach people to expect more from the future than from the past, and not interpret the future in terms of the past, and to emancipate people from the es war, from the it was, which rests like an elk on the shoulders of the people. Use the Marxist metaphor. And this is something that you still find, for example, in someone like Adam Smith, because when Adam Smith talks about exchange as the basic relation of society, of economy as the basic economic relation, this means that there's a certain tit for tat notionship, the notion in this. So vengeance, in the theory of moral sentiments, is a natural given. He says it's a grammatical imperative. It's embedded in language itself, that you need to avenge injustice. It is this very position, this very culture where, and the very notion of social justice that is derived from this. Everything from reparations to payback. That Nietzsche wants to heal us from, so to speak. And this is interesting. It is actually something that connects Nietzsche and Marx, for example. You will not find the notion of social justice in Marx. If it features it, he criticizes it, for example, in the critique of the Gotha program. Justice can only be defined in terms of established values of a situation that already of a social system that already exists. Whereas, of course, true justice is something that still needs to be invented. That will only appear out of the revolutionary scenario where something really new appears. something that's irreducible to the past. So Nietzsche and Marx are very modernist in this regard. That's really where they find themselves. So, yeah, generosity, and the text where I refer to Sloterdijk is that, well, he sees Nietzsche a new kind of apostle, right? Where he is an apostle that teaches us to overcome the burden of ressentiment, the debts that bind us to the past, that always need to be repaid. And that begins, and of course, the apostle of generosity, where generosity is defined as an aristocratic value, of course, but not in the sense of historical aristocracy, because that is based on the past and inheritance. But aristocracy or generosity as a relation to the future, right? As a change of and mutual enrichment. Of course, you can still interpret all this as an apology for unbridled capitalism and trickle-down economy and so on. There is, especially in Sloterdijk, there is a risk that this happens. There is a German professor, Norbert Bulls, who is also an AfD sympathizer, who actually makes these sort of arguments and says that we need to overcome ressentiment by giving the capitalist, the entrepreneurs, free reign, and then the rest will profit from it, whatever. For me, that all still falls very much within classical liberal thought. I think Nietzsche is about something else. It's more about avant-gardist gesture. But generosity is a key part of that. Nietzsche himself mentions the example of Mirabeau, who was a kind of a survivor in the French court and also in the French Revolution. Why? Because he did not take anything personally. So he was not nachtragend, how do we say this in English? He had no grudges. He was incapable of holding grudges. That means that you have, it almost makes you a saint, right? You have a sort of saintly character towards other people because it's based on unconditional generosity.
Beautiful. So, like my last question is somehow a small digression to your last projects on care, but also found it very interesting and beautiful that to distance yourself from that interpretive gesture of priest, let's say, or even judgmental gesture, you're making this distinction between core and care. You know, like you make a distinction, like you say rather Leibniz drives the why to you are from care, or
the great question of the principle of sufficient reason. Why? It derives it from care.
Yeah, so I found it interesting because even here we can somehow relate this generosity that you were talking about to this question of care, even when it comes to ressentiment.
Yeah, of course. Nietzsche, of course, has a very specific idea about the philosopher as a physician of culture, right? The priests, they take care of the sick, the weak, whatever, and the philosopher takes care of the strong. The task of the philosopher is to protect the strong against the weak, against the man of ressentiment. My question was, of course, can we also care for the man of ressentiment in a way that is not pastoral? That was always the question. Because in my reading of the three polemical positions, they all lack in the end of sufficient reason of talking about ressentiment that extends beyond the mere polemics. No.